Alright guys, welcome back to another video. So in this one we're going to be making a fairly simple wool and leather satchel, handbag. I don't quite know what you want to call this one. And yeah, I'm very excited about it because one of my main goals when I got into leatherworking was to be making bags. But not just leather bags, I mostly wanted to focus on making bags out of multiple different materials. Things like wool, canvas, just any other types of fabric, because I always found that very interesting. I always liked the look of it a lot more. And so wool is something that originally I never really thought about, but looking at one of my absolute favorite bag designers, they go by the key name Not Less or Equal on Instagram, Behance, Pinterest. They're on a whole bunch of different places. There'll be a link to a lot of their social media in the description down below. And they've actually made a few different bags out of wool, and I just find that that texture, the look of the wool, is so very interesting. So for the design of this bag, I am pulling exactly off of one of the bags that Not Less or Equal designed. And I'm going precisely off of one of his designs because honestly I have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to bag design. And one of the ways that I've found even in woodworking helped me learn what I was doing was by looking at other people's designs and kind of working backwards. So I know what the final piece needs to look like. How do I go about actually creating that myself? And so what I'm going to be doing with this project is doing exactly that. I looked at that final bag that he designed, and I'm kind of working backwards in just with the knowledge that I have to try and figure out how to recreate it. Now, I don't know if any of the materials that I have are the right ones. I don't know if the wool that I bought was right. I don't know if the thickness of leather that I'm using is even right for this project. This is all about learning. And this is honestly my favorite part of any new hobby that I've started is that initial phase where you're just trying to figure things out. It's just so much fun to go in and just figure it out. You don't have to go in and be perfect the first thing you do. It's all about just kind of messing around and trying different techniques. And again, here, my biggest thing is I'm just going to use the techniques that I know to try and see if I can create the thing that I want. And what I found a lot while working on this project was that there's a lot of little things that I still need practice with. The key one is, as you can see here, cutting things out. I do still struggle quite a bit with this. I know it seems like a very simple idea to just, cut some pieces of leather out of a larger piece, but there's a lot of interesting things that I learned. For example, you saw me using that round-headed knife that I bought recently. That's a really good knife, but I found that going back to a box cutter later on after this project was actually much easier for cutting out larger portions of these pieces. Whereas that round head knife actually works really well for skiving and other parts of the leather project. So it all just comes down to this learning process. And now that I actually have a decent amount of tools and I've got a very nice setup for my leather work, I'm very excited to get a lot better at it. And speaking of skills that I need to improve on, skiving is definitely one of them. So for those of you that have done leatherwork in the past, you probably know that this is not the right technique for this type of knife. But at this point in time, I didn't know any better. And so again, it's one of those things where going back and looking at this project a little bit in the future here, it's funny to see how much my skill sets have changed, how much more I've learned in just a little while. But again, it's all about learning how to do this stuff in the best way possible, and that 100% comes from experience. Now, I've watched a ton of videos on how other people do this. I've seen all the different tools that people use to do the same thing. It's very interesting to me, much like woodworking, how in leatherworking, there's about 100 different ways to do the exact same thing, and all of them have their pros and cons. And so this is also one of my favorite things about making these videos is because now after I've had the project completed, after I've been using this bag for a few weeks now, I've been taking it back and forth to work with me, which is what I do with most of my bags, which is kind of interesting. But now that I've used the bag and I can look back at the process of making it, this is a great opportunity for me to kind of figure out what I did wrong or what I would do differently in the future. Because again, this is the beautiful part of learning a new skill is when you can look back on exactly what you did, you can actually much more easily figure out what you need to do differently in the future. It's very hard when you look at a finished product, like you finished a project and you're moving on to the next thing. looking back at that and trying to figure out where you went wrong is a little bit more difficult. You know, you can look at it and say, okay, this part is not right, but actually figuring out what you did wrong can be kind of complicated. So for me, going back and being able to look at and edit these videos lets me have a second chance to look over all of the techniques that I used and just figuring out exactly where things didn't go right. And there's no better example of that in this project than this point right here, trying to attach this leather to the wool. I had nothing but trouble because I tried to use that spray-on adhesive because at that point I thought that was going to be the best idea. I didn't want to use the liquid adhesives, you know, the contact cements and that I've been using on a lot of other parts because the wool was kind of disintegrating a little bit. It was getting pulled apart too easily. So I thought the spray-on adhesive would be the best idea. Now, you know, a few weeks later, I've actually learned to use a lot of like double-sided tape in what I've been doing with my leatherwork, and that is a much better way of working compared to using the spray-on adhesive. So again, it just comes down to learning all these different little techniques, and especially when you start blending materials, that's where things honestly got a lot more complicated, because when I was just working with the wool, I could kind of figure that one out, or when I was just working with the leather is actually super easy to work with in a lot of ways. In some ways it's a little bit more complicated, but it's you know, one of the things I like about working with leather is it's a very rigid material. Unlike wool or canvas, your leather is not going to stretch as much as when you're working on it. Whereas one of the biggest issues I ran into with this wool is that no matter what I did, whether it was the stitching or I was just holding it weirdly, it would stretch out and would kind of change the dimensions that I was trying to match. And that created a lot of problems and was something I definitely had to try and figure out how to work around. But eventually I kind of figured it out and it did come out just fine. But that's again one of those things where your different materials are going to behave very differently. And when you try to match those two materials together, you try to attach them together, that's where things kind of get a little bit interesting because you're trying to contain the stretchiness of that wool so that it lines up nicely with that leather or that more fixed dimension leather. Now, I will say that, again, this project didn't come out absolutely perfectly. There's a lot of things that I definitely would do differently, and I do plan to actually remake this same style bag again, probably in the near future. Because there's a lot of things that I learned while working on this bag that I want to try again. I want to kind of use this same form, this same structure, and just see if what I've learned from doing this bag as well as a bunch of the other ones that I've done recently, if there's anything that I would do differently. And again, like I said, there's a lot of things I would do differently. And yeah, it's just all these little lessons that were learned. Now, one of the things I will say the first thing I would do differently if I was to remake this bag is I would change up the dimensions significantly. Because in the end, this bag ended up being way smaller than I thought it was going to be, which I find absolutely hilarious. You know, there's certain parts of this bag, like these the shoulder strap parts that I'm working on right now. This part, I would keep this the exact same size because it was kind of the perfect scale to what I was imagining. But the actual physical bag itself came out significantly smaller than I kind of imagined. Now, again, this is one of the things that I've been struggling a lot with as I get into doing more bag making, is figuring out the size. And this is always one of the funniest things, again, going back to any hobby that I've started, but primarily with the woodworking that I've done in the past, figuring out kind of the typical sizes of things should be is very challenging. You know, if you think of like a dining room table or a dresser, even just drawers in any piece of furniture, figuring out what a good size is, you know, it's a little bit difficult because you might think a 4-inch drawer is too small, but in reality, you know, a 4-inch drawer on a smaller cabinet can offer you a decent amount of storage. So exactly like that in this case, this bag, as I was planning it out, I was going off of all these different measurements. You know, I was measuring myself, trying to figure out how big this bag should be. And so these were all just kind of a best guess. And along with that, I'm still trying to figure out how the dimensions of these 3D flexible objects actually work. Because it's one thing, you know, when you have a piece of wood, you cut it to 10 inches long, that piece of wood is going to stay 10 inches long. And you butt it up against another piece of wood, it's still going to stay at that 10 inches. But in order to make the shape, that 3D shape of this bag, you know, you're wrapping these pieces of fabric around, you're stitching them on the inside. You know, none of your dimensions are, you know, super fixed. None of them are kind of written in stone. And so you gotta kind of think about that too as you're planning out your pieces. You know, you gotta add in that seam allowance. You have to account for a little bit of stretch or a little bit of not stretchy material in the case of the leather. It's very interesting how these pieces come together, and it takes so much extra thought that is just something I'm not quite used to. And again, this is one of the projects where I really started to learn, because before this, a lot of the projects I was doing were plans that other people had put together. And what I find when I do stuff that is made by other people is that I don't learn as much. You know, it's always a good place to start because you know that the project you're making, as long as you follow the plans that you have, that project is going to work out because somebody else has gone through the effort of making the plans. But when you start designing your own stuff, that's where you kind of start to figure out, okay, I made this thing 6 inches, and in the future, this thing actually needs to be 15 inches because of some mathematical equation that I didn't think about or that I didn't consider. And so that's one of the things I actually really love about this bag. And you're going to see a little bit of a last minute adaptation here. So what I'd wanted to originally do was make this a backpack. I wanted 2 shoulder straps so that you could throw this thing on your back and use it that way. And so when I got to the end of this project and I realized that this bag was just significantly smaller than I originally thought it was going to be, I had kind of 2 options in my mind. One was that I could go with my original backpack idea, and this would be like a kid-sized backpack, which, you know, that might have worked out. I have a young nephew, I probably could have given it to him, but it's also something that I wanted to test out this bag myself and see kind of what the longevity of that wool is going to be. And so in the end, I decided to just put a nice long shoulder sling on it, and I was able to actually just use this as a bit of a satchel. And again, it's worked out quite nicely. I've been using it for a few weeks now, you know, just kind of on my way back and forth to work. It's a great little bag, and again, it comes down to a case of it's just something that I want to see how long it lasts, or if there runs into, you know, any issues of that wool breaking down, getting ripped, anything like that. So of all my recent leatherworking projects, this is probably the one where I learned the most just about the structure and how to make the thing that way that I wanted to. And I know that that sounds very vague, but it makes sense in a way. So as we reach the end of the video here, guys, I just want to thank you for sticking around and watching the video this far. I know that the leatherworking is not so much my forte here on YouTube, but I'm hoping that going forward, we're going to have a good mixture of these leatherworking videos and woodworking and just all the different styles of videos. So again, thank you guys, and I do hope you enjoyed this project, and I will see you in the next one.